Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today we are covering another unusual build from the Burning Crusade era. A specialist AoE DPS build with the highest potential DPS in the entirety of the expansion. Just before we jump in guys, apparently only 11% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to the channel, so I would appreciate if people did actually quickly subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to see more content like this. So this Pyromaniac build is not massively unknown, because what mages tend to do is they spec for raiding, for optimizing single target damage, and then with the leftover talents they add a few survivability options or they add refined AoE DPS to their build. But what I've done, because Endless While, the server I'm playing, has dual spec, we can just switch between two specs. So what I've done is I've decided to refine an exclusively specialist AoE spec, and this is basically what I've come up with. This spec definitely isn't optimal for single target DPS, although it does actually do pretty good DPS on bosses and stuff like that. And to put and to bear in mind that the AoE DPS itself is so ridiculous that I would not recommend it in a raiding environment, and I wouldn't recommend actually using this build without a Protection Paladin. You may be able to use it in raids with a Protection Paladin, but if you're using this build and using this rotation, which I'm going to show you in a bit, you're definitely going to pull aggro off a Prot Warrior or a Druid tank. It's not even viable when you have the wrong tank in the group. You need a Protection Paladin, you need to wait about 4 seconds and then start doing your DPS, and that's the only way you can actually make this build work, because the DPS that you do is absolutely ridiculous. When you have mages, like a couple of mages or maybe even 3 mages with a Warlock in the group doing this kind of AoE DPS, the mobs are going to die so quickly. A lot of the time pulling aggro won't matter that much because you're doing so much ridiculous burst DPS, they're going to die before they're going to do any real damage to you. So this build will be absolutely ridiculous for dungeon farming, rep farming, all that kind of thing. So let's take a look at the build. This is the build with all of the core talents. A few of them are kind of single target talents, but mainly you go for the single target talents because obviously when you do actually get to a boss you want to do decent DPS on a boss, but mainly it's just to get down the tree. So first of all we have improved Fireball. It's really just there to get down the tree, although obviously it's a bit of a DPS boost when you actually have to deal with the bosses. Next we have Ignite. Ignite obviously will massively increase your AoE DPS because it procs off Blast Wave, Dragon's Breath, Flame Strike, all that kind of thing, so that's why it's there. Flame Throwing, it's just, just useful. It's one of those talents that just gets us down the tree. Improve Flame Strike. So what you're going to be doing in this rotation is using Flame Strike rank 8 and rank 7 in conjunction together to do massive AoE DPS of those two abilities, and obviously a little bit of extra crit chance is going to definitely help. Pyroblast, you don't actually use Pyroblast, you're really just getting it for the Blast Wave. Then you have Burning Soul, gives you fire chance. Yeah, the main reason you get this one, obviously it's kind of useful the first part of this talent, but mainly it's to reduce your threat caused by your fire spells. And because you're going to be doing so much DPS, this one is actually pretty mandatory. Next we have Master of the Elements. It will refund 30% of the mana cost of a spell when you crit. You will be critting a lot, so this will help out, but in all honesty, after every single pull you're going to be doing so much DPS and burning so much mana you're going to be drinking after every single pull anyway, but don't worry about that because you will still be getting through the dungeon pretty quick. Blast Wave, one of the core abilities in the build, so you definitely need this. Critical Mass, pretty straightforward, a little bit of extra cheeky crit chance. Playing with Fire, very boring, flat, 3% increase to your spell damage, again just simple talent to increase your DPS. Same with Firepower, 10% extra fire damage. Combustion, you are going to be using this in your AoE rotation too because it is ridiculous. Pyromaniac, just reducing the mana cost and increasing your hit chance. You don't really need hit chance that much to be honest because you're only going to be using this build against dungeon bosses and dungeon mobs, so hit chance isn't absolutely essential. Next we have Molten Fury, just increases all the damage that you're going to do when the mobs are below 20% health by 20%, so again just a little bit of extra damage. We have Empowered Fireball there just to get down the tree, and then we have Dragon's Breath, which is another core ability in a rotation. And then the main talents from here are going to be in the Arcane Spec. First of all, Arcane Subtlety. The main reason you get this is to reduce your threat of the arcane spells by 40%, which is really strong, because for a lot of the time in this build, the majority of your DPS does actually come from Arcane Blast, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the rotation section. And then Arcane Focus is really just there to get you down the tree, although the hit chance is pretty nice from that. Arcane Concentration, a little bit of extra mana efficiency, not absolutely essential. You can go for survivability talents here if you prefer. Another essential talent though is Arcane Impact, which is going to increase the crit chance of Arcane Blast by another 6%, so that is very cheeky indeed. So from here you've got a number of options and you can do whatever the hell you want, to be honest. You can go for Impact, which will obviously increase the survivability of a group a little bit. Because you're doing so many fire spells in an AoE situation, this will proc a lot and it will help keep you alive just in case you pull aggro. So this is probably one of my preferred talents, to be honest. I will just max out Impact if I'm going for this build. You can increase the damage of Fireball here if you want to increase your single target damage when it comes to taking down bosses. You can increase your hit chance, although that's not really essential. Dampen Magic buff, that's fairly decent to be fair. Then you can go for a few cheeky talents of the Arcane Tree, like Improved Counter Spell if you want that 4-second silence, and then an Arcane Meditation, which is actually pretty useful for mana efficiency. You can even go for the Mana Shield if you want. You can really do anything. I would also recommend Fire Ward and Ice Frost Warding, they're kind of useful. You can go for Improved Scorched again to increase the damage on the boss, but mainly, you know, you really are just, it's really up to you, because the core talents are or what I've basically showed the build just before. So this is the core build and you have 7 points left over to put into whatever utility or survivability options that you want. So let's talk about the playstyle of this build and, you know, what it's all about and how it does such ridiculous DPS. So the first thing you're going to do is cast a rank 6 Flame Strike. The reason why we go for rank 6 rather than rank 7 first is because it's just going to basically generate less threat. It's going to allow the tank to basically get a little bit more threat over you, and then you run into a rank 7. The reason why we do 2 different ranks is because you can't stack Flame Strike. Like if you use the same like rank, it wouldn't stack. If you use 2 ranks separately, then both of those Flame Strikes are actually going to take effect. So that's the reason why we do that. Then you run into do a Dragon's Breath, and then into a Blast Wave, and then you finish off doing Arcane Blast, and that's pretty much the standard rotation. Now you may have to alter it slightly depending on how skilled your Protection Paladin is and obviously how geared he is, because you may or not pull aggro off him. Sometimes you may want to go in there steadily using Arcane Blast, so don't spam Arcane Blast, go in there straight away, use Arcane Blast about 1 or 2 times and then run into Dragon's Breath and do whatever you have to do. Normally I would recommend waiting about 4-ish seconds before you actually start doing any DPS in any shape or form at all. If you're in a situation where the mobs have less health, you simply just need to burst them down faster, then I'll probably blink in, open with Dragon Strike into a Blast Wave, and then just use Arcane Blast and I'll forget about the Flame Strikes. The Flame Strikes will optimize your DPS, like you do more damage like in the whole fight, but they will do less DPS. So you appear to do higher DPS if you just use Dragon's Breath, Blast Wave, and then Arcane Blast. But if you do the Flame Strikes, you will overall do a little bit more damage. So that's kind of up to you. But you will also burn a lot more mana if you do the Flame Strikes. So a lot of the time people don't even bother with the Flame Strikes, to be honest. And sometimes, in all honesty, the Flame Strikes are kind of like an iffy thing to do because obviously the mobs are going to move. So a lot of the time you don't actually use a Flame Strike. But sometimes it comes in useful, sometimes it doesn't. It's just something to bear in mind. Flame Strike also does generate a lot of aggro compared to the other abilities, so that's another thing to bear in mind. As you can see by this clip, I was obviously padding by taking down mobs that don't actually have to be killed, but let's just forget about that for a second. I did actually achieve 5,000 DPS, bearing in mind that Mage in that current state had only just hit level 70, he didn't really have that many like gear pieces at all. I think he had like 2-ish blues or 3, so not very good gear at all. 5k DPS, as you can see, it is pretty ridiculous. One thing I obviously do want to quickly mention is you should be using Molten Armor for that increased crit chance, obviously to get a little bit more Ignite procs out of your AoE fire DPS, so that is something to bear in mind too. Now let's just kind of finish talking about why does this build work, because if you're not very familiar with playing Mage, most people just think, well, don't mages just use Blizzard, and that's like how they do their AoE DPS, and it's ridiculous AoE DPS. But it actually turns out that if you're gonna really like nail it down and calculate it all, just spamming Arcane Blast does more DPS than using Blizzard. So obviously when you implement Dragon's Breath and Blast Wave into the rotation too, which do ridiculous damage, and that's why they have a cooldown, then you actually do much more damage than just using Blizzard. Now I do actually have a Blizzard AoE spec at the moment. The reason why I have that at the moment is because I normally get grouped up with Warriors and Druid tanks. So using Blizzard tanking, Blizzard AoE DPS with obviously the Blizzard slow, the chill effect, it's basically just a safer way to do AoE DPS. And I normally achieve anywhere between 1k to 1.2k DPS by using Blizzard. but you can easily get right up to 2000 DPS on average with the Pyromaniac build because it does so much more damage. But obviously it's kind of risky because if you're grouped up with a prop protection warrior or druid or something like that, you are just going to pull aggro over time and die. So that's why I've opted for the Blizzard spec. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend using this build if you're doing dungeons, unless you're grinding dungeons with a guild friend, like you have a friend who's a protection paladin and you know that you're going to be grouped up with him like 90% of the time, or at least most of the time when you're doing your dungeon farming or whatever. Then this spec is definitely worthwhile investing into. For when you get to level 17, you start grinding dungeons for your pre-rep and slot gear and stuff like that, then I definitely recommend trying it out, because even if you go into raiding Karazhan and stuff like that, you will be able to do half decent DPS, and the build will be very useful in Karazhan because there's a lot of AoE trash to clear, and even on fights like Ilhoof and stuff like that, the AoE DPS will be very, very useful. So obviously when retail comes out, if it ever comes out, you won't be able to have dual spec. But I definitely recommend trying out this build again for messing around in dungeons, farming rep, and then obviously it will have some massive use in Karazhan as well, in my opinion. So I definitely, I don't think it's that much of a specialist spec, to be honest, with a very niche value. I think it's a very valuable spec, which I definitely recommend a few mages messing around with, when TBC does come out, and then probably respec into a more raid specific spec when you start raid logging instead, and when you're not doing as much dungeons. But anyway, I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover in this video. My name is Medagoblin. Until my next video, ciao. So what I'm going to do in this video is, first of all, show you the build itself, talk about other key talents and stuff like that, and then I'll finish talking about the playstyle and the rotation, what spells to use in what order, and why it works so ridiculously well.